Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes, around about 10 minutes of ancient warfare related ranting and musing, where I attempt to answer a question from a reader, listener, or viewer. You can ask a question. You can, of course, comment on a previous podcast or video. You can send me a postcard. You can send me an email, AWA@caravansaraipublishers.com. Even Murray@caravansaraipublishers.com will get to me. I think there's even another email address. Lots of ways to catch me. You can, of course, support us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Now, today's question is from John Smith JJ2YD. Now, I don't know I've discovered that young people have these weird ways that when you see things like that, there's actually two ways of saying it. I don't know. I'm not going to involve possibly something to do with yards. Anyway, John Smith, he asks, are there any examples of a formation being flanked and the troops in the flank turning to engage the attacker while the forward lines remain engaged to their front, i.e. two sides of a rectangle facing out and engaged in combat simultaneously while maintaining cohesion? Okay, wow. Now, this is a little bit like I'm going to be saying this a lot in the few answers that I'm coming up to give in the next while. This is a little bit like a Meryl Streep, Alec Baldwin, and Steve Martin movie. It's complicated. See what I did there? And that is because most of our examples of an army being attacked in the flank lead to its defeat. We do have some examples of an army being outflanked, but perhaps accidentally or not being part of the plan. There's the idea at the Battle of Delium in 424 BC that the Theban commander Pagondas summons cavalry. They come around and the Athenians presume that it's an entire new army to outflank them, or it could be the cavalry that's ridden around the hill. Accidental, kind of. You've got other ideas at the Battle of Nemea, where the Spartans on their right defeat and outflank or overlap the Athenians on the left flank of the Allied army, defeat them, and then they wheel and attack the Argives further down the line. So again, it's a accidental. By Alexander, you've got this idea of him riding and driving his forces to the right and thereby creating a gap. He's not riding around the Persian armies. They're huge in comparison to his own, but he's creating a gap by creating a weakness in the corresponding left wing of the Persian army, which is sort of what you're talking about. But perhaps for me, the best example of what you're asking in terms of an army maintaining cohesion and continuing to fight on that flank, even when it's outflanked, is, I think, the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. Of course, there are other examples of outflanking which leads to disaster: Chaeronea, Kynoskephalae, and even Pydna, really. Kynoskephalae especially, because there's sort of like two battles being fought, and a cohort breaks off from the right flank of the Romans and attacks the exposed left flank of the Macedonian army and runs amok. However, getting back to my example of a battle where I think there is two lines engaging on an outflank is the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. Now, again, like the film, it's complicated because this is the battle at which Thucydides, in his description of it, talks about the fact that hoplite armies always tend to move to the right as they hunker into the shield of the man to their right because of their own exposed right side. And indeed, what you get at the Battle of Mantinea, and apologies to any of you listening, I'm doing descriptions with my hands. Indeed, the allies, so the Mantineans, the Argives, the other Arcadians and allies from the Peloponnese, and the Athenians on the left flank, they advance going to their right. Meanwhile, the Lacedaemonians and their allies advance, and they also move towards their right flank. So when the two armies meet, their centres are meeting the opposite flank of the enemy. So they're not meeting head on. So what you find is that the Tegeans are on the right side of the Spartan army, and they are sort of basically left with nothing to do because there's no enemy opposite them. Meanwhile, on the Allied right side, the Mantineans and Argives attack the Brassidae and the Scritai and essentially run amok. Now, that normally would mean that they were winning the battle, but of course, the Spartans again make this amazing turn and go and sort of seek that problem out. Now, the reason that I think that this battle is what you're asking about, let me get the description of it, is it's also an amazing battle because Thucydides gives us a huge breakdown of the Spartan military organization. Of course, it's where most of our information comes from, and we then compare him to Xenophon, who describes the Spartan organization later in the 4th century BC. There are some differences, and we tend to try and mesh those two together to make an understanding of what the Spartan army looked like. And weirdly, we have more information about the Spartan army than we do about things like the Athenian army or the Argive army or even the Theban army. Now, what you've got is the army's advance, and what Thucydides tells us is that as soon as the Spartans charged, now, we get this other lovely piece of information that when the Allies and the Athenians charge, they make all this noise, whereas when the Spartans charge, they're quiet, and that upsets and is disconcerting to the Athenians. What happens, however, is as they charge, he tells us that the Allied army flees almost before the Spartans make contact. This can't be actually the case because there's casualties, so they are indeed engaged in battle, and so the problem then is that you've got the Mantineans, Arcadians, and elite Argives on the Allied right are victorious, and on the Allied left, the Spartans are victorious are against the remainder of the Argives, the Cleonians and the Orniates, and the Athenians. Now, they flee from the battle, but we're told that the Athenians alone offer resistance. And what Thucydides tells us, this is all in Book 5, Chapter 73, also an account of the battle in Diodorus, Book 12, Chapter 79. What Thucydides says is that only the Athenians offer resistance. Now, it becomes a problem because the Athenians send 1,000 hoplites and 300 hippace. Now, normally, of course, what we would interpret that to be was that the hippace are cavalry. But, and I've argued in the magazine, there is evidence that there's an Athenian unit of hippace is not cavalry as such, but like the hippace of the Spartans, they are an elite unit or a special unit of 300 men. And there's evidence of this unit in the Battle of Plataea and several other places, especially at the Battle of Mantinea. Now, what happens, of course, is that they're being attacked frontally, and then the remainder of the Peloponnesians start to outflank and attack the extreme left flank of the Athenian force. Now, what we've got is the idea that on the very extreme left flank, which is where the hippace are, they turn to face this outflanking, and they are allowing the withdrawal or the flight of the remainder of the troops. Now, it's really interesting in that sense because if it's cavalry, they're doing a particularly unusual action for cavalry, and that is that they are fighting against in-formation enemy hoplites coming towards them, which is one of the reasons I think that this hippace is not cavalry, because they seem to hold them off, which is not really the purpose of cavalry in this period of time. And that the other thing, of course, is that the Athenians and the allies near them suffer 200 casualties, including both generals. And it's Laches who Socrates saves the life of at the Battle of Delium and has a conversation in several of the Platonic dialogues with. So he dies at this battle. And so it's really interesting that you've got this idea that an Athenian unit. Now, if you want to argue that it is the cavalry, I have no problem with that. Most people say that when they see the word Hippace, when it's not related to the Spartan bodyguard hoplites, it's cavalry. But it could be hoplites, and they seem to certainly operate as hoplites at the Battle of Mantinea. So on the extreme left, these 300 Hippace are holding off the advance and the envelopment of the Spartans as the remainder fight frontally, and even though we're told that they flee at the first charge, some men are staying there. It's not like the field gets vacated. So perhaps the rear ranks of the Allied army flee and run as soon as the onset happens, but there is this rearguard action happening by the Hippace and the Athenians, and they suffer 200 casualties, which, given that they have 1,300, is quite high casualties for a hoplite battle. Now, it's interesting that you've got essentially the frontal attack, and then you get the sense that the Hippace on the extreme left flank of the Allied army, the Athenian Hippace, turn to face this outflanking and an attempted envelopment. And so I think, in relation to your question, that I think is the first time that happens, and one of the few. And in most other cases, the turning of a flank is a disaster and leads to imminent flight and defeat. There are probably other examples, but I think it's the first one I can think of in military history where that doesn't happen, even though it's a defeat, and even though they are giving ground, they are in fact fighting as they withdraw. So I hope, John, that answers your question, and you can join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.